When you saw the headlines about tariffs on Canada during the Trump years, you were probably told a very simple story. America was being tough, standing up for itself, using tariffs as a weapon to force a neighbor to bend. And then, just as quickly, the story moved on. But if you slow down and actually look at what happened, the reality is almost the opposite of what most people were led to believe. What was presented as a show of strength ended up exposing deep weaknesses in how the U.S. economy is organized, who really pays the price for trade wars, and how little control political leaders actually have once they pull certain economic levers. I want to walk you through that calmly and carefully because this is not really about Canada. It is about how power works in a capitalist economy and how often it boomerangs back on the very people it claims to protect. Officially, what happened was this: the Trump administration imposed tariffs on a range of Canadian goods, especially steel and aluminum, arguing that these imports threatened U.S. national security and harmed American producers. A tariff, just to be clear, is a tax placed on imported goods. It raises the price of those goods once they cross the border. The stated goal was simple: make Canadian products more expensive, push buyers toward U.S. producers, protect American jobs, and pressure Canada into making trade concessions. That is the surface level explanation, and if you only hear that version, it can sound straightforward, even logical. But if you are a worker, a small business owner, or just someone trying to make sense of rising prices, you need to ask a different question. Who actually pays these tariffs, and how does that payment ripple through the economy you live in every day? Because tariffs are not paid by foreign governments. They are paid by importers, which are usually domestic companies, and those companies almost always pass the cost along. They pass it to manufacturers, to retailers, and ultimately to you as a consumer, or to workers through lower wages, fewer hours, or layoffs. That is not ideology. That is how the mechanism works. To understand why the U.S. ended up hurting itself, you have to understand the tight economic integration between the U.S. and Canada. These are not distant rivals with separate production systems. They are deeply intertwined. Steel crosses the border multiple times during the production of cars, appliances, and machinery. Aluminum from Canada is a key input for American manufacturing. When you tax those inputs, you are not just taxing Canada, you are taxing U.S. factories that rely on them. You are raising costs inside your own production chain. Think about it from the perspective of a U.S. manufacturer. You run a factory that turns steel into finished products. Suddenly, because of a tariff, your steel costs more. You have three basic options. You raise prices and risk losing customers. You absorb the cost and cut into profits, which often leads to pressure on workers. Or you try to find alternative suppliers, which is rarely quick or cheap. None of these options is painless, and none of them magically creates new jobs. In fact, many companies reported the opposite: higher costs, delayed investments, and greater uncertainty. Canada, for its part, responded with its own tariffs on U.S. goods. That is how trade wars work. Retaliation is not an accident. It is built into the logic. Canadian tariffs targeted politically sensitive U.S. industries, including agriculture and manufacturing. Suddenly, American farmers and producers found themselves losing access to a major export market. If you were a worker in one of those sectors, this was not an abstract policy debate. It showed up as lost orders, falling income, and fear about the future. What makes this story so important is that it reveals a basic truth about modern capitalism. Production is global, but political power is still mostly national. When politicians try to use blunt tools like tariffs in a highly interconnected system, the effects rarely stay contained. They spread, often in unpredictable ways, and they tend to hit those with the least power to protect themselves. Workers do not set trade policy. Consumers do not negotiate supply chains, yet they are the ones asked to absorb the shock. As we go deeper, I want you to keep one thing in mind. This is not about whether trade should be completely free or heavily restricted. Those are real debates with real trade offs. This is about understanding who decides, who benefits, and who pays when those decisions are made. And once you see that clearly, it becomes much harder to accept the simple slogans that dominated the conversation at the time. To see how we got to this point, you have to step back and look at the long history of U.S. trade policy and the promises that have been made to working people over decades. For a very long time, both major political parties told workers the same basic story. Trade deals would make goods cheaper, markets larger, and prosperity more widely shared. When jobs were lost or wages stagnated, workers were told to retrain, move, or simply accept that this was the price of progress. By the time Trump came along, there was deep anger and resentment built up across large parts of the working class, especially in manufacturing regions hollowed out by decades of plant closures and offshoring. That anger was real, and it deserved serious answers. Trump's trade rhetoric tapped directly into that frustration. Tariffs were presented as a kind of economic muscle, a way to punish foreign competitors and restore American strength. But here is where the story takes a turn that rarely gets explained. The U.S. economy that existed when those tariffs were imposed was not the economy of the 1950s or 1960s. It was not an economy where most production happened within national borders. It was an economy built around global supply chains designed to maximize corporate profits by sourcing inputs wherever they were cheapest and most convenient. U.S. corporations helped build that system. They lobbied for it, invested in it, and structured their entire business models around it. So when tariffs hit Canada, they did not hit some external enemy. They hit a partner embedded inside U.S. production itself. Canadian steel and aluminum were not luxuries, they were inputs. They were part of the everyday functioning of U.S. industry. If you live in a town with an auto plant, an appliance factory, or a construction supply business, this matters to you directly. Higher input costs mean tighter margins. Tighter margins mean pressure from shareholders and executives to cut costs elsewhere. And too often, that elsewhere is labor. What made the situation even more revealing was how quickly large corporations adapted in ways that undercut the stated goals of the tariffs. Some firms sought exemptions, others shifted supply chains in ways that bypassed tariffs without bringing production back to the U.S. In other words, the corporations with the most resources found ways to protect themselves. Meanwhile, smaller firms, which lacked legal teams and global flexibility, were often stuck paying higher costs. This is a classic pattern in capitalism. Policies are framed as helping the nation or the worker, but the actual design and impact end up favoring those with the most power. You might be thinking, wasn't this at least good for U.S. steel producers? In some cases, yes, certain domestic producers saw short-term gains. Prices rose and profits improved for a while. But even here, the picture is more complicated. Steel-producing jobs are a small fraction of the total jobs that depend on steel as an input. For every worker making steel, there are many more workers using it to make something else. When costs rise across that much larger sector, the net effect can easily be negative. Protecting one slice of industry can end up harming a much larger one. This is where the Canada story becomes a kind of economic lesson. Trade policy does not operate in a vacuum. It interacts with corporate structure, class power, and the relentless pressure to maximize profit. When you ignore those realities, you get outcomes that look shocking on the surface, but are actually quite predictable. The U.S. did not get wrecked because Canada outsmarted it. The U.S. hurt itself by using a simplistic tool in a complex system without addressing who controls that system and why. And that brings us to the deeper question you should be asking as a viewer. If tariffs were really about helping workers, why were workers not given more say in how trade policy was designed? Why were corporate interests still at the center of decision making? And why, when the costs became clear, were workers once again told to be patient, flexible, and resilient while profits and executive pay remained largely protected? These are not rhetorical questions. They go to the heart of what this episode reveals about power in the modern economy. Now, let me slow this down and walk you through the mechanics a bit more carefully, because this is where the myth really collapses. When a tariff is imposed on something like steel or aluminum, the immediate effect is a price increase at the border. But the real action happens after that. That steel does not just sit in a warehouse, it moves through factories, distribution centers, and retail networks. Each step adds costs, each step involves decisions, and each decision is shaped by who has power and who does not. Imagine a U.S. company that assembles farm equipment. It buys steel from Canada because it is reliable, close, and often cheaper even after transportation. A tariff raises the price overnight. The company calls its Canadian supplier, but the supplier cannot absorb the cost without hurting its own workers or shutting down operations. The U.S. company looks for an American supplier, but finds limited capacity, higher prices, or long delays. So the company raises prices on its equipment. Farmers now pay more. Some delay purchases. Orders slow down. The factory cuts overtime, then shifts, then jobs. At no point in this chain does a foreign government write a check. The costs cascade through the system and land on people whose names you will never see in a headline. At the same time, Canadian retaliation kicks in. Canada targets U.S. exports strategically: agricultural products, manufactured goods, consumer items. If you are a U.S. farmer selling into Canada, you suddenly face higher barriers. Your products become more expensive there. Canadian buyers look elsewhere. Your income drops, and then you are told that the government will help you with subsidies to make up for the damage. Think about that for a moment. First, policy hurts your market. Then public money is used to partially compensate you for that harm. That is not strength. That is a costly loop that shifts resources without solving the underlying problem. What is especially important here is how unevenly this pain is distributed. Large multinational corporations often have diversified markets. They can shift exports, reroute supply chains, or wait out the storm. Workers and small producers cannot. They are tied to specific places, specific jobs, specific communities. When disruption hits, they feel it immediately. This is why trade wars tend to widen inequality even when they are sold as nationalist or pro-worker policies. The flexibility belongs to capital. The rigidity belongs to labor. You might ask, why didn't policymakers anticipate this? The uncomfortable answer is that many did. Economists across the political spectrum warned that tariffs on intermediate goods would raise costs and invite retaliation. The risks were not hidden, but political incentives favored dramatic gestures over careful planning. Tariffs look decisive. They sound tough. They fit neatly into campaign speeches. The slower, messier work of rebuilding domestic industry, strengthening labor power, and coordinating industrial policy does not produce quick applause. This episode also exposes a deeper contradiction. Politicians talk about national interest, but the economy they govern is not organized around national well being. It is organized around private profit. U.S. corporations spent decades designing supply chains that crossed borders because it increased profitability. When tariffs disrupted those chains, the corporations did not suddenly become patriotic manufacturers committed to domestic reinvestment. They became problem solvers for themselves. They lobbied, adjusted, and protected their margins. Workers were expected to absorb the turbulence. If you are watching this and wondering why it always seems like economic shocks land on ordinary people first, this is why. The system is built that way. Trade policy becomes a tool used on top of a structure that already concentrates power upward. Without changing that structure, the tool cannot deliver the promised results. It can only reshuffle who loses first and who loses most. And this is the moment where the Canada tariffs stop being a narrow trade dispute and start becoming a mirror. They show us an economy where political leaders make bold moves, corporations maneuver around them, and workers are left navigating the fallout. The real question is not whether tariffs are good or bad in the abstract. The real question is who controls the economy in which those tariffs operate, and whose interests are treated as secondary when things go wrong. At this point, it is worth talking about responsibility because trade policy does not just fall from the sky. It is made by people, advised by institutions, and shaped by pressures that are often invisible to the public. In the case of the tariffs on Canada, the Trump administration framed the decision as a matter of national security and economic sovereignty. That framing mattered because it allowed the tariffs to bypass some of the usual debate and oversight. But behind that framing were familiar actors, corporate lobbyists pushing for exemptions, industry groups fighting over whose costs would rise and whose profits would be protected, politicians calculating who would feel the pain later rather than sooner. It is important to be clear here. Not every official involved believed the rhetoric, and not every advisor agreed on the strategy. There were internal disagreements, warnings, and pushback. But the structure of decision-making gave far more weight to corporate interests than to workers or consumers. Steel producers had a direct line to policymakers. Manufacturers who used steel often had less influence. Workers, especially non-unionized ones, had almost none. That imbalance shaped the outcome long before the first tariff was announced. And then there is the media's role in all of this. Much of the coverage treated the tariff fight like a sporting event. Who is winning? Who blinked first? Which country got the better deal? That kind of framing distracts from what actually matters. If you are a worker who lost hours, or a farmer who lost a market, or a small business owner whose costs spiked, it does not matter who won the press conference. What matters is that your livelihood became more precarious. Those stories rarely lead the news, even though they are the real economic impact. This also helps explain why the U.S. did not get the leverage it expected over Canada. Canada's economy is smaller, but it is not powerless. It is diversified, politically stable, and deeply embedded in global trade networks. Retaliation was calibrated and targeted, and because the two economies are so intertwined, Canada knew that pressure applied to the U.S. would echo back into politically sensitive regions. That is not clever trickery. That is basic strategic response in an interconnected system. But here is the deeper irony. Even if Canada had fully conceded, even if every trade demand had been met, the underlying problems facing U.S. workers would still be there. Low wages, insecure jobs, communities dependent on a single employer, a political system heavily influenced by money. Tariffs cannot fix those things. They never could. At best, they can shift pain temporarily. At worst, they create new forms of instability that make long-term solutions harder. If you think about your own life, this might feel familiar. You are told that a bold move will fix a deep problem. The move creates disruption. You absorb the disruption, and then you are told to be patient because the benefits will come later. Meanwhile, those at the top remain insulated. That pattern repeats not just in trade policy, but in financial crises, austerity programs, and corporate restructuring. What this episode really teaches us is that economic tools cannot substitute for economic democracy. You cannot fix a system built around profit maximization for a few by tweaking prices at the border. Without worker voice, strong labor protections, and public investment guided by social need rather than private gain, policies like tariffs will always fall short of their promises. As we move toward the larger consequences of this episode, I want you to hold on to that idea. The failure here was not just tactical, it was structural. The tariffs did not fail because they were imperfectly executed. They failed because they were dropped into an economy designed to prioritize capital over people. And until that design is confronted honestly, we should expect more policies that sound powerful, feel disruptive, and leave ordinary people asking why they are the ones paying the bill. Once you understand that, the wider consequences of this episode start to come into focus. Trade wars do not end neatly. They leave residue. Uncertainty lingers. Investment decisions get postponed. Relationships between suppliers, workers, and communities are strained. Even after tariffs are lifted or reduced, the damage does not simply disappear. Companies that hesitated to invest do not suddenly catch up. Workers who lost jobs or hours do not easily regain lost income, and trust, once shaken, is slow to rebuild. For the U.S., one of the lasting effects was a clearer signal to the rest of the world that trade policy could shift abruptly based on domestic political needs. That makes long-term planning harder, not just for foreign partners, but for U.S. businesses as well. Capital likes stability. When stability erodes, firms respond by protecting themselves, often by becoming more cautious, more automated, or more global, not less. That means fewer commitments to local jobs, fewer long-term investments in communities, and more pressure on workers to stay flexible and expendable. There is also a democratic cost that rarely gets discussed. When people are told that a policy will help them and it does not, cynicism grows. Workers notice when promises are not kept. Farmers notice when markets vanish. Small business owners notice when costs rise without relief. Over time, that breeds distrust, not just in one administration, but in institutions more broadly. And that distrust can be exploited. It can be redirected away from systemic causes and towards scapegoats, whether they are other countries, immigrants, or fellow workers. That dynamic is dangerous because it fragments the very groups that might otherwise push for real change. At the human level, this story is not abstract at all. It is about families adjusting budgets because prices went up. It is about workers taking on extra stress as overtime disappears. It is about communities watching yet another economic promise come and go without delivering security. None of that makes headlines, but it shapes how people experience the economy every day. And if you are living that reality, being told that the country showed strength on the world stage can feel deeply disconnected from your own experience. This is where a system-level reflection becomes unavoidable. Capitalism, as it is currently organized, rewards short-term advantage and political theater over long-term stability and shared prosperity. Trade policy becomes a stage for signaling toughness rather than a tool for coordinating production, protecting workers, and planning for the future. Without mechanisms that center human needs, even well-intentioned interventions can backfire. You might be wondering whether this means tariffs are always a bad idea. The honest answer is no. There are contexts where targeted trade measures combined with strong domestic policies can support industrial development and labor standards. But notice the combination. Tariffs alone do not do the work. They have to be paired with investment in workers, infrastructure, technology, and democratic oversight. Otherwise, they become just another shock imposed from above. The Canada tariffs showed us what happens when that broader framework is missing. A dramatic policy move collides with a profit-driven system and produces outcomes that surprise only those who were not paying attention to how the system actually functions. And once you see that, it becomes harder to believe that the next trade fight or the next economic quick fix will turn out differently if the underlying structure stays the same. As we approach the end of this discussion, the key question is not whether the U.S. won or lost a trade dispute with Canada. The key question is what kind of economy we want to live in and who gets to decide how it is shaped. If policies continue to be designed without meaningful input from the people most affected, the results will keep looking like this: loud promises, real disruption, and very little lasting benefit for those at the bottom and the middle. And that brings us to the moment where I want to step back with you and ask what lessons, if any, were actually learned. Because history has a way of repeating itself when the underlying causes are left untouched. Trade conflicts come and go, administrations change, slogans shift, but the structure remains remarkably consistent. Decisions are made at the top, justified in the language of national interest, and then filtered through an economy where profit, not human need, is the organizing principle. When things go wrong, the costs are socialized downward, while the flexibility and protection flow upward. If you are someone who felt whiplash during those years, confused about why the economy felt so fragile despite all the tough talk, that confusion makes sense. You were being asked to interpret a complex, global system through a series of simple narratives that did not match reality. Strength was defined as disruption. Success was measured in headlines rather than outcomes. And when the disruption landed on workers, consumers, and small producers, it was framed as an unfortunate but necessary sacrifice. What this episode ultimately reveals is a failure of imagination. The idea that the only tools available are tariffs, tax cuts, or deregulation reflects a narrow view of what economic policy can be. There are other possibilities, policies that give workers a real voice in trade decisions, industrial strategies that rebuild capacity while guaranteeing wages, training, and job security. International cooperation focused not on corporate access to markets, but on shared labor and environmental standards. None of that is easy, but none of it is impossible either.